On behalf of the Berkeley Center on Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law, we welcome you to this conference on global resistance to sexual harassment and violence. The Berkeley Center brings together academics, advocates, and activists who work on issues of inequality and anti-discrimination law on a comparative basis. We have over 600 members on every continent but Antarctica. This conference was initially scheduled for London, but due to the coronavirus pandemic, we have instead put it online. This is the first of 7 panels that will be distributed prior to the date of the live conference, with the live conference held on London time on June 8th and 9th of 2020. This panel will be a discussion among 7 experts on a global report on sexual harassment and violence. We have a remarkable group of experts who will join together for this discussion. We have 2 Berkeley students who are with us as producers, Laura Valencia and Kelly Crabtree, and I thank them for their work on this production with the understanding that if it looks absolutely brilliant, it's because of them, and if it doesn't, it's because of me. Now, without further ado, we'd like to introduce some of our speakers and begin the discussion. Thank you for joining us. Our next panelist is Purna Sen with UN Women, and she runs the project that looks at the status of women within the United Nations, a really important function in international law and organizations, and we're really delighted to have you here with us today. Could you say a few words about yourself and your work?
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Yes, I'm afraid I have a long title. I'm the Executive Coordinator and Spokesperson on addressing sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination for UN Women. And my role is coordinating within the organization on our work on sexual harassment. So that's bringing together our colleagues in human resources, on security, violence specialists, and so on in an internal piece of work. I lead for UN Women in system-wide work across the UN, which is looking at reviving, revamping, improving our work to end sexual harassment. And it has a third element, which is connecting beyond the UN to the world more at large around the movement of Me Too and the sexual harassment advocacy mobilization that's going on currently across the world at the moment. And before that, I've worked on issues of violence for about 30 years and race equality for 10 years before that. And I've worked researching, teaching as an academic, as an activist, as a human rights person around issues of violence, culture, and rights.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker on the panel is Robin Runge. And Robin is both an activist and an academic. She's at George Washington Law School, and she works very closely with the ILO, the International Labor Organization. Robin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work briefly?
Thank you, David, for this opportunity. My name, as you said, is Robin Runge, and I wear 2 hats. I was a full-time law professor for a number of years and have been teaching part-time at George Washington University for the last 16 years. And in addition to that, I'm the co-director of the Equality and Inclusion Department at the Solidarity Center, which is the largest US-based global workers' rights organization. And through that work, I've had the privilege of leading our partners, women workers around the world in a global campaign to end gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. And one of the big successes of that work was the adoption by the International Labor Organization of a global binding standard to eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work, and specifically gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. So I write around that intersection of gender-based violence and harassment and employment. I've been doing that for about 20 years. And I've also represented workers, women who have experienced those crimes and those civil rights violations, and now I have the privilege of working globally with low-wage workers, particularly to ensure that the remedies designed include their personal experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now, Furaha-Joy, who is from Tanzania, and Africa End Sexual Harassment Initiative.
Thank you very much. My name is Furaha-Joy, and I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a little bit about my region and what is happening around the issues of sexual harassment. I'm a lawyer who specializes in research, and so a lot of my work has really just become increasingly across different African countries and analyzing the status of sexual harassment laws in different African countries, and really also looking outside of the continent on how laws have been developed or are developing around this very important issue. I'm currently participating from Nairobi, but I'm usually based in Tanzania, but I'm also a Zimbabwean citizen.
Thank you. And Karen Vandekerchkhove, Belgium, who is of the Gender Equality Unit within the European Commission.
Yes, hello to everybody. Hi, my name is Karen Vandekerchkhove. I am head of unit at the European Commission in the unit dealing with gender equality. I'm usually based in Brussels, but I'm now also zooming in from Berkeley, where I am spending a year as an EU fellow. I'm familiar with this topic because at the European Commission, the Gender Equality Unit deals with all matters of women's rights, which includes economic and political empowerment, so including matters of work-life balance, gender pay gap, political decision-making, economic decision-making, but also gender-based violence, including sexual harassment.
Thank you. We have Katharina Miller from Spain, the president of the European Women Lawyers Association. Please, could you tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this virtual space. Yeah, my name is Katharina Miller. I am German born. I've been living in Spain now for the last 11 years, and I'm the president of the European Women Lawyers Association. And that's why sexual violence or sexual harassment is very important for me, because I want to understand what can we do to prevent it and to make this world a safe place for women and girls.
Thank you. Also on our panel today is Puja Kapai, a professor of law at the University of Hong Kong. And tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Thank you, David, for having us here. It's really a pleasure to join all of you. I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Hong Kong, and I'm also convener of the Women's Studies Research Center, which is an interdisciplinary center bringing from across the university and the community more broadly, people working on gender, sexuality, and race and other diversity-related issues. I've done extensive work on sex discrimination, racial discrimination, and minority rights more broadly during sort of my academic life, but I also try to connect that work with what is happening on the ground. And so to that end, I've made extensive submissions to the government on law reform and on aspects that need addressing, particularly in the wake of the Me Too movement, but also in relation to ongoing political crises in Hong Kong. And sadly, in a way, these two have come to be connected in a way that has been unexpected. And I'll be speaking a little bit more about that and reflecting a little more about how the Me Too movement globally has manifested itself in Hong Kong and the shape it's taken here, but also some of the ripples we see of that in the mainland more broadly.
Thank you. That sounds so interesting. The next of our speakers is Natasha de Silva, and she is with the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Thanks so much, David. And it's lovely to be joining everyone, and particularly this panel session today. And I am going to speak a little bit about an inquiry that we conducted here in Australia into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. It was a very broad-ranging inquiry. We think it's a world first. And so in my presentation, I'm going to give you some of the key findings arising from the inquiry, and then also outline some of the recommendations that we made.
So our next speaker on the panel will be Rachel Vogelstein. And Rachel is with the Council on Foreign Relations. And Rachel, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work before we get into your presentation.
Sure. My name, excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat. My name is Rachel Vogelstein. I lead the Women and Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, where we analyze how elevating the status of women and girls advances U.S. foreign policy objectives. In my capacity at CFR, I am currently writing a book called Awakening about the global Me Too movement, analyzing the activism that we've seen from women around the world. And I also am a professor of gender and foreign policy at Georgetown Law School, and spent the last 20 years before that as an advisor to Secretary Hillary Clinton on domestic and global women's issues.
Thank you. We're really delighted to have you here today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And now let's hear from Purna Sen about the global resistance to sexual harassment and violence from her perspective at the United Nations.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks for the opportunity. I think it's really important that we do recognize and remember that what has happened over the last few years around sexual harassment is a global movement, and it is a movement. It is both a moment, which people talk about, but it is also a movement. And I believe very strongly that the moment has been created by a movement, and the movement will continue to do its work. So there's 3 points I'd like to make to start with, if I may. I should have said also, please excuse the sunglasses. I've got an eye problem at the moment and I can't manage the light, so I hope that's not a problem while we video this recording. So there's a couple of things I want to say to start. First of all, that the Me Too movement was not only about the US or about Hollywood or about celebrity, and I still hear people sometimes trying to dismiss it as one of those. Secondly, Me Too, we have to acknowledge, did not connect everyone into this global conversation, dialogue and resistance, as you've rightly been calling it, against sexual harassment. It didn't connect those who weren't on mobile phones. It didn't connect those who felt unsafe to speak. And so there are some pockets, some areas of work that we have to acknowledge haven't been part of this movement. And I think that's a challenge for the movement as it goes forward. And thirdly, the third point around Me Too is it changed the world. The Me Too movement has significantly changed the world. And I'd like to come to that in a moment. But the power of Me Too, I think we need to recognize its novelty in the way it has brought change, because it was spontaneous. It wasn't funded. It didn't have a formal leadership. And people who made this movement happen and who changed the world in ways I'll come to in a moment have never met each other. Most of them have never met each other, and they never will. But what happened was that they used a medium that has been overly used to vilify, to harass, and to bully, and to intimidate women. Change that social media channel, or those channels, I should say, into an incredibly powerful space of solidarity. And that power of solidarity is what has changed our global conversation and the expectations that workers, primarily women, but not only women, have of the world of work. If I may just draw on a little bit of data work we've been doing at UN Women, we've been looking at Twitter around the Me Too movement and the Me Too hashtag. There are some numbers that I'd just like to share that I think are quite phenomenal, and they tell something about the story of the global connection that is Me Too. When Alyssa Milano tweeted her tweet in October 2017, within the first 24 hours, there were 500,000 impressions on Twitter using that hashtag. Within the first 24 hours, there were 4.7 million mentions of Me Too on Facebook, 24 hours only. Now, we're looking at Twitter over the last, between 2017 and the end of December 2019, I can give you some statistics that tell you the purchase of this movement, this voice, this moment of reckoning around sexual harassment. There were over 24 million impressions on Twitter using Me Too hashtag and related hashtags. The top 5 countries which engaged with this were the USA, in order: the USA, Argentina, India, Japan, and Spain. I think that's really quite interesting in terms of the international connections to the urgency of this discussion and to the expectations of change. I don't have time now, but we've looked at the data across different countries, and it's amazing the range of countries that have been involved in the Me Too movement, in their urgency and the unavoidability of this conversation and the demands for change, from Uruguay to Egypt to Malaysia to Belgium. It has connected with people, primarily women, in so many parts of the world. It has felled some big names from their positions. I will end with what impact it's made in a moment, but if I may just say, I'm painting a very good picture, a positive picture of the Me Too movement and the changes it has brought, but I also want to recognize that this is not a cost-free exercise or a movement that has not had negative impacts for people. One young woman in Bangladesh, we may have heard of, Noor, was killed after she spoke about sexual harassment. Many women have gone into exile. Women have been subjected to defamation cases. They have lost their careers. They have lost their reputations, and they've obviously been harmed. But Me Too has, in other ways, been a coming together and has shaken the world and the way it talks and understands sexual harassment. So in terms of its impact, I think what we'd like to note is that we have a different global discussion. I think we will find very few people in the future who will legitimately and credibly be able to say they don't know what sexual harassment is, or they don't think it matters. It has changed public discourse in that way. We have a new ILO convention adopted after the Me Too movement or during the Me Too movement, but the work for that started long before, and I think Robin will say more about that, so I won't. I think it has drawn connections in ways that activists and academics and researchers have always said can exist: sexual harassment, sexual violence, and other forms of violence. And those linkages have been made much stronger and clearer to different audiences. It has also uncovered conversations about power, about privilege, intersectionality, and placed the work against sexual harassment in a context of human rights. I think it has profoundly changed expectations of workers in the workplace in terms of what they expect, that they expect to be heard, they expect to be listened to, and they expect accountability of those who have abused them, and they expect justice for themselves. Me Too has been global. Me Too has changed the world.
Thank you so much, Purna. We're now going to hear from our next panelist, and that will be Robin Runge.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's a wonderful moment to be talking about the efforts globally to address gender-based violence and harassment, and particularly the role that the International Labor Organization has played. I think that the work that I'm most familiar with globally is related to a multi-year campaign by women unionists that started several years before the Me Too movement to prioritize in the workers' movement globally and at the International Labor Organization the need for a global binding convention to address gender-based violence and harassment. And the way that came about is that the Solidarity Center was a part of an effort to bring women workers from different parts of the world and from different sectors. So domestic workers from Central and South America, agricultural workers from Morocco and Tunisia, garment workers from South Africa and Cambodia and Indonesia, together to have them explore collectively what the primary barriers were that they were facing to achieving gender equality in the workplace. And repeatedly what came up were different forms of gender-based violence and harassment, that it became incredibly clear that a primary barrier to equal pay, to decision-making opportunities, to promotions, to formal work was gender-based violence and harassment, and that it was an incredibly powerful tool of oppression. And because it was identified by workers globally, it was recognized that it was a global problem. As they all disclosed their experiences, it became very clear that there needed to be a global solution. Unfortunately, what they disclosed is that even though several of their countries had laws against certain forms of gender-based violence and harassment, such as sexual harassment, those laws either were insufficient because they actually did not address what they were experiencing, or they were also not being implemented. And they had all had experiences with the power that the International Labor Organization has, because it's the only place in the world where representatives of governments, representatives of employers, and representatives of workers come together to negotiate binding standards that then all countries that are members of the International Labor Organization, all employers and all workers groups have to abide by. And so they started a multi-year campaign by providing education and awareness, collecting data about what's happening. And so that was part of the power of these women bringing their voices to this space. And actually, after several years, in 2015, they were able to convince the International Labor Organization and the representatives from governments and the representatives from employers to say, yes, we need to put this on our standard setting agenda. We actually need a binding convention, not a recommendation, not some guidelines, but actual clear regulations that would prohibit these forms of violence and harassment. So after a series of 2 years of negotiations in Geneva in May and June of 2018 and June of 2019, the International Labor Organization did adopt a global labor standard to eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work, including expressly and prioritizing gender-based violence and harassment. And there are three key pieces to this instrument that I think are really critical in this moment. The first is that it is reflective of a feminist and women's rights perspective, and specifically the rights of low-wage workers, which is what the majority of women workers in the world are, by the way, and also workers in the informal economy. First, it defined gender-based violence and harassment broadly to include both individually experienced forms of targeted gender-based harassment and violence, but also recognizing it's systemic and that it's structural and that it needs structural and systemic problems, because it actually is a societal problem. It's not an individual problem. Second, it's about power. It's not about sex. It's all about power. It's all about inequality. And so a lot of the language in the document recognizes the risk factors of structural inequality, precarious work environments, occupational segregation, that actually are breeding grounds for these forms of abuses, and that they have to be changed, that actually the workplace and how it's organized to change the culture has to change, and that cultural change has to take place. Third, it defines the world of work more broadly than any place I've ever known. And that is, it includes the commute to and from work. It includes your home or someone else's home where you may be performing work, even if you're not getting paid for it or not getting paid very much for it. It includes where people go to the restroom. It includes internet communications. It includes transport, away from workplace meetings. And that's really critical. And then the third place is that it covers all workers. And so the definition of worker includes people with no formal contract, people who have no direct connectivity to an employer. It includes the supply chain model. It includes interns, apprenticeships, volunteers, anybody with a connectivity and who's actually performing work. And I can't say how important that is. The last point I just want to make is that it actually expressly includes domestic violence in its definition of gender-based violence and harassment, and it expressly recognizes the impact that domestic violence has on an individual worker's ability to do their work. And that, in fact, if a worker who's a domestic worker experiencing worker in that violence in that home that's gender-based, it also may be domestic violence and gender-based violence and harassment that way. So it's really important to recognize that ratification of C-190, ratification of this convention by individual countries actually would provide tools to governments and employers to prevent those forms of abuses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Let's hear now from Furaha-Joy.
In Africa, I believe that there's really been quite a great awakening about the problem of sexual harassment, and I think this really began to take root around 2018, when a commission of inquiries were established to look into allegations of sexual harassment. So these were pretty big institutions and universities. When we, when we began to conceptualize the possibility of a regional model law on sexual harassment for Africa, it was also really based on what we noticed was like the inconsistencies and of the various laws across the continent, and knowing that we did not even have, and realizing that we did not have a single African country that had a comprehensive law on sexual harassment. And so we noted a lot of gaps, a lot of inadequacies, and also how a few parliamentarians, policymakers, feminists had been really making attempts at an individual level to try and bring changes into the laws. And this was not always done very effectively. So we realized that our best bet was to really create a movement that would really bring this issue at a regional level, establish it as a regional issue that required regional dialogue, and that would bring in people together to discuss this at a regional platform and make use of that platform. So that's how Africa Ends Sexual Harassment Initiative was actually born. We literally have partners from the North African region, from Tunisia, from Egypt, from South Africa, from Kenya, obviously from Tanzania, from Cameroon, from Nigeria. You know, it's been a very exciting and dynamic movement so far, and outside of that, there were quite a lot of in other initiatives that were taking place that were really bolstering the work that we had begun to do. For instance, the BBC documentary on Sex for Grades, where they looked at sexual harassment in 2 African universities, in Nigeria and Ghana. The full documentary is actually horrific. You know, it's a horrific thing to really watch the whole thing and see what you know, very grown men are doing to really young girls entering university, and some of them, as you know, at ages of 16 or 17, you know, can be entering, you know, this world of university, and you get targeted by predators who, you know, this is their way of life, and with impunity. So really, Sex for Grades was really released when Africa Ends Sexual Harassment Initiative was already in full motion. So that really bolstered us as well as a movement to say that this really justifies the reason why we are fighting for change on the continent. In terms of litigation, I would still say, and this is also because there is, you know, the laws are not very reliable, you know, and the procedures for raising complaints and the confidentiality processes in many countries are just not clear. You know, it's just not a confidence building process for any woman to lodge a complaint. So so litigation is very low, you know, in our continent. We're currently doing a mapping of court cases across the African continent. And I can tell you that I'll be very surprised if we have one country that has more than 10 cases on sexual harassment. So this is because the support structures are just not there to make complaints, and the power imbalances are too wide, too varied, you know, and so one cannot even begin to contemplate making that kind of move, you know, because it really also comes down to real bread and butter issues that you'd rather just struggle along and survive and try to hold on to your job and put up with the sexual harassment because this is the only option that you have. You know, this is one of the reasons why we find this movement so relevant, because it has really allowed us to keep in touch with what is happening in different countries. It's because of the network that we have that we can quickly detect or get certain information about what is happening around this issue in specific countries. So we're excited, and we believe that post-COVID-19, some of the plans that we unfortunately had to stop, we're going to be continuing that in full force, and getting ready to host the first regional conference on sexual harassment and the law in Africa, and begin to really lobby for a regional model law for the continent. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Furaha-Joy. And Karen.
For the European Union, I will report 3 developments, more from a helicopter point of view, regarding sexual harassment and gender-based violence more generally. The positive developments is the adoption by the European Commission of a new strategy on gender equality ahead of the European Women's Day earlier this year. This strategy contains ambitious measures for the next 5 years, including on gender-based violence and sexual harassment. And I think the importance of this strategy is that it shows the high-level commitment on the side of the political leadership in Europe to create a society in Europe where women and girls can feel safe and where we move really towards gender equality. As one of the first actions in implementation of that strategy, the Commission proposed earlier this year that member states adhere or ratify the ILO Convention on Sexual Harassment at the Workplace. So this is a global standard, specific global standard on tackling work-related harassment and violence. And so with this action, the European Commission launched the necessary legislative process to incorporate it into the EU member states' legal and the EU's legal framework. The less positive development, I think, is that we can see that despite this high-level commitment in the EU and in most of the member states, I think in particular about Spain and this very encouraging development in Spain, is that we experience nevertheless a serious backlash in a number of member states. Now, this is not entirely new, but the worrying development that we see recently is that the current pandemic seems to create some space for some governments which are getting free reins to address the crisis, to adopt measures that are threatening fundamental rights, including women's rights. And I'm only going to mention a few ones. I think earlier this week, Hungary decided formally to stop its process of ratification of the Istanbul Convention. But the Istanbul Convention, for those who may not be familiar with it, really offers a comprehensive and unique standard on the matter, with very strong obligations for states on prevention, protection, and punishment. I think the Istanbul Convention somehow is a good example of the increasing resistance against gender-based violence and sexual harassment because of its success, but also the debate that it triggers also shows the resistance against the resistance. And you can see that in particular in those countries where you see a backlash against women's rights more generally. So there are many arguments, and probably underlying these arguments are the unwillingness to accept the structural nature of gender-based violence and the power relations that are beneath it. But so it's a worrying development, I think, that we should mention that some countries which previously committed to join the convention and to join this global fight against gender-based violence and against including sexual harassment are now backtracking and making use of the pandemic to accelerate that backtracking process. A second expression of this backlash, which we see is also intensified in the current pandemic, is that some countries also take advantage of the crisis to even more directly attack women's rights. I think, for instance, in a number of countries, you see movements to restrict sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls. For instance, one of the most down-to-earth examples is the refusal to consider abortion as an essential service, which must continue during the current pandemic. And what we also see in the current pandemic is a serious cut in state funding in some states to women's organizations who provide essential services to defend the human rights of girls and women, and which are at the risk of closing down. So these are worrying developments, I think, developments that are not entirely new, but I think that we see intensifying with the current pandemic. Finally, the last development that I want to mention is more of a personal reflection. We see again in the current pandemic a focus in Europe on an issue which is very urgent and which is domestic violence, and moving away from other types of violence. And I think we cannot deny that domestic violence has intensified during the pandemic. The lockdown particularly has created a dangerous situation for women who are stuck at home with their abusers. And therefore, I think we need to pay special attention in the coming months that this COVID-19 does not take over all the attention and all the resources, and that we continue to fight all forms of violence, including also sexual harassment.
Thank you, Karen. Katharina.
So, according to the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the FRA, sexual violence affects 1 in 2 women within the European Union. I don't want to focus on the European Union. I want to focus on Spain today, because the European Union exists of, at the moment, and unfortunately, 27 member states. I say unfortunately because we just lost 1 member state. So in Spain, 1.5 million women, which is 7.2% of residents that are over 16 years old, have suffered sexual violence outside their relationship. And this is according to a national macro survey on violence against women from 2015. In my country, 893 daily cases of sexual violence are reported. And this is according to data from the Ministry of Interior from 2018. This situation requires a comprehensive law and a political and social commitment aimed at building a life free of violence for women and girls. Yeah, so we were very happy this year that the first measure of the Ministry of Equality, and during the first week of International Women's Day, has been a preliminary draft of an organic law for the, I quote, guarantee of sexual freedom, stop quoting, which still has to go through the reporting and parliamentary processing phase, so it might be modified. But I would like to talk a little bit about this proposal, because I think it's very ambitious and very interesting for all our countries worldwide. Because In this legislative project, the difference between abuse and aggression disappears. And until now, this has been classified according to the existence of intimidation or violence. Once approved the law, this will depend exclusively on consent. There is no consent, and I quote, when the victim has not freely manifested their express will to participate in the act due to conclusive and unequivocal external acts in accordance with the concurring circumstances. I stop quoting. This has been one of the demands of the Spanish feminist movement for decades now, and that the Spanish Supreme Court finally accepted in the famous La Manada judgment, when thousands of people took the streets demanding real protection for women. To sum up, without consent, sexual violence takes the form of aggression rather than abuse. The proposed sexual freedom law includes new aggravating circumstances in the event that the acts are accompanied by, I quote, extremely serious violence, I stop quoting, drugs are used to nullify the will of the victim, or when the aggressor is a partner, ex-partner, or family member. This new proposed law also provides socio assistance measures for victims, even in cases where there is no complaint, but other forms of aggravating sexual violence, such as reports from social services, health, or specialized centers. This measure focuses on the protection of survivors without having to go through police or judicial procedures that can lead to secondary victimization. As Amnesty International already analyzed in its recent report, I quote, "It is time for you to believe me," I stop quoting, from 2018. This investigation denounces the lack of public policies which generate a deafening silence for decades, and the journey full of obstacles and prejudices faced by women victims of sexual violence, mainly fear of not being believed, stigmatization, and lack of confidence in the authorities. The bill proposes specialized training and specific care resources that are two essential tools to eliminate these obstacles. Some territories, such as Madrid, where I live, already have a 24-hour crisis center for the care of women victims of sexual violence. That was my report on our state in Spain, and I hope that this law comes through and will come to an end after COVID-19.
Thank you very much. And now let's turn to Puja. And Puja, tell us about what's happening in Hong Kong and in Greater China.
Thank you, David. So Hong Kong has had a fairly weak system in place from the get-go. We introduced our laws relating to sex discrimination back in 1995. And we had a quasi-governmental body that was set up, which is the Equal Opportunities Commission, to deal with sexual harassment in specific sectors. And the model very much draws on a conciliatory approach initially. So complainants would, as Natasha said, complainants bear the burden to initiate a complaint, and they would have to file a complaint with the commission, who would then seek out the respondent and then develop sort of an opportunity for them to conciliate the complaint. That hasn't been a very popular model in Hong Kong for a number of factors which are common to other jurisdictions, but particularly there is a unique context where such a conciliation approach actually undermines and increases the risk of secondary trauma experienced by many, particularly women, but victims of sexual harassment in general. There's also the challenge that the criminal law demands a very exacting standard everywhere in the world, but in particular in Hong Kong, where there is a stigma and shame associated with victims of sexual violence or sexual abuse or sexual harassment. There is this reticence for women to come forward for a number of reasons. And so what I've found is that the procedure has actually in many ways reinforced many of the challenges that we witness worldwide with victims coming forward. For example, there's a power imbalance between the sexes to begin with, and those are the conditions in which sexual harassment tends to happen in any event. And Hong Kong remains a deeply patriarchal society, as does China more broadly. There is a Confucian culture which underpins a lot of our social interactions, and there are certain expectations. So for example, if a victim comes forward, we have a typical sort of response and expectation. We expect the perfect victim. The victim should have been demure or should have screamed for help and never put herself in that position in the first place. And so there's a great deal of scrutiny a great deal of scrutiny that she attracts by bringing the complaint in the first place. And most women are not willing to subject themselves to this kind of a social trial, one would say. On the other hand, we also see sort of this challenge that society has in reconciling the gentleman rapist sort of notion that, you know, this man, he's a good family man, he's a religious and pious person, he's done so much for the community, that it's almost impossible to imagine that he would be an aggressor in any of the circumstances. So this kind of patriarchal model through which victims and complaints are viewed really exacerbates the conditions in which women are pushed to sort of utilize this system, which reproduces systems of power. And it has been fairly ineffective. So research relating to the Equal Opportunity Commission has demonstrated that the conciliation first approach hasn't really been that effective. In terms of the context of what happens when cases go to trial, I think it's very instructive to actually look at how the Me Too movement has played out in Hong Kong. So as many of you would have sort of gauged, there hasn't been that much noise around Me Too in Hong Kong, but really the burden has largely fallen on very young people to sort of bear this flag. And it all started with Vera Loy, who is Hong Kong's first Asian indoor games gold medalist, who's called the Queen of Hurdles. And she posted a selfie on her Facebook page with the words Me Too written on it. And she said that this was a birthday present to herself. And she talked about abuse that she experienced when she was 13 at the hands of her sports coach. And that he had sexually harassed her under the pretext of massaging her muscles. Loy experienced a deal of public support, and she was declared this hero and a role model. She also got received a lot of backlash, as did many other women who tried to come out about their own experiences. And that really boiled down to, and I think is well illustrated by the magistrate who dealt with her case. So her complaint was pushed forward by the chief executive of Hong Kong, who called on the police commissioner to investigate her case. And that's something that never really happens. It has to be victim initiated, but here you have the opposite. The situation was taken out of her control. A prosecution was brought forward. And in the end, the judge said that her account didn't match her actions. She didn't tell anybody immediately after. She didn't reposition herself when she was experiencing the abuse. She could have stopped it, but she didn't. And she continued to maintain contact with her coach after the incident for several years. And all of this, the magistrate said, unfortunately, cast doubt on her as to whether what had happened was sexual abuse in fact. In China, we see similar sort of backlash against women, but a more peculiar kind. There, women who have come forward against very powerful men, even though there have been large numbers of complainants, have often been threatened with and slapped back with defamation lawsuits. And that has really proved to be a very strong deterrent for such complainants coming forward. So this kind of trajectory doesn't really bode well, especially with China. We also saw this mass censorship of the Me Too sort of catchphrase or hashtag, you could say. But activists have been very creative and also used rice money and other alternatives to get around the censors. But in this context, we're very aware that there's a wide range of problems. For example, sex education is underdeveloped in the curriculum, so most students aren't entirely sure about their rights and how to protect themselves. A recent survey has shown that people are having their first sexual encounters even younger and younger, around the age of 10 or 11 even. and university-based surveys done by the Equal Opportunities Commission shows that more than 50% of the respondents to the survey had experienced sexual harassment in the preceding year. We need to challenge rape myths. We need a lot of frontline training to handle issues with sensitivity, particularly on the part of teachers, social workers, and peers, parents, and judges. We need to reform our outdated laws and enhance interventions. And I think in line with what Natasha shared, we need to develop an ecosystem where there is no wrong door, that no matter where victims decide to turn, and no matter what pathway they choose to heal, that they should be adequately supported in all of these efforts.
Thank you, Puja, so much. So, Natasha, tell us, please, about what's been going on in Australia.
Thanks very much, David. So the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces that was undertaken by the Australian Human Rights Commission began in June 2018 and ran for 18 months. With the final report entitled Respect at Work, tabled in our Parliament on the 5th of March this year. So Respect at Work drew on a 2018 survey that we conducted of 10,000 workers with respect to their experiences of sexual harassment, 60 public consultations with over 600 participants, 460 written submissions that we received, international comparative research, as well as some economic modelling. The inquiry was also informed by consultations with key international stakeholders, many of whom are part of the Berkeley Sexual Harassment Group, and include UN Women, women's groups in China, government meetings in Brazil, and discussions with some activists and academics in Hong Kong, including my fellow panelist, Puja Kapai, with us today. So the goal of the inquiry was to examine the nature and prevalence of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces, its drivers and measures to address and prevent sexual harassment. So headline key findings, we found that sexual harassment is prevalent and pervasive. It occurs in every industry in Australia, in every location, at every level in Australian workplaces. Interestingly, the number of Australian workers who had experienced harassment, sexual harassment in the last 5 years jumped from 1 in 5 in 2012 to 1 in 3 in 2018. We found sexual harassment is incredibly costly. The economic modelling that was conducted estimated that workplace sexual harassment cost the Australian economy 3.8 billion Australian dollars in 2018 through lost productivity, staff turnover, and other associated impacts. We found that sexual harassment is a systemic problem, not just a matter of individual misconduct, as we hear from time to time, and that the underlying cause is without a doubt gender inequality. And we also found that the current system in Australia for addressing workplace sexual harassment is complex and confusing for both victims, but also for employers, and that it places an inappropriate, what we view as an inappropriate heavy burden on individuals to make a complaint. And that I think explains some of the very low reporting we have in Australia, with only 17% of Australians who said they experienced sexual harassment in the past 5 years going on to make a complaint or a formal report. So key recommendations, we made 55 recommendations in Respect at Work, which is intended to shift the dial from Australia's current reactive and complaints-based approach to require one that is more positive in action from employers and focuses on prevention. Our recommendations are targeted to government, to professional associations, to the business sector, but also community organisations as well. And largely they fall into 5 key areas. The first is data and research. So we identified an ongoing evidence gap with respect to harassment, sexual harassment in Australia, and we recommended that a national sexual harassment research agenda be developed to deliver and collect industry-based information about the nature of sexual harassment and also the effectiveness of primary prevention strategies. The second area in our recommendations was primary prevention initiatives. we found that primary prevention strategies have to target the whole population to actually transform systemic and gendered nature of sexual harassment. So we recommended that initiatives prioritise social change strategies, that we target groups that we know are at higher risk, that includes young people. And also we suggested that there be some media guidelines be developed for reporting on sexual harassment. The third area for recommendations was the legal and regulatory framework, and this was a very significant area for us and probably the one we spent the most amount of time on. We found that in Australia, sexual harassment is legislatively regulated by our anti-discrimination laws, our industrial relations system laws, and our work health and safety laws. And the interaction between these three schemes can be inconsistent and confusing. So we recommended that they be refocused to be more mutually reinforcing of the roles that discrimination, industrial relations, and workplace safety play, including, importantly, the introduction of a positive duty for all employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate sexual harassment. We also recommended that we develop guidelines for the use of non-disclosure agreements in sexual harassment matters, which was another significant area that we looked at. The fourth area was workplace prevention and response, and we essentially introduced a framework for businesses to help them both prevent and respond to sexual harassment that focuses on things like leadership, risk assessment, transparency, building a culture of respect, and improved workplace education, as well as data collection. And the fifth area was victim support, advice and advocacy, where we saw an urgent need to improve pathways for support services for victims, including speedy referrals between services, and ultimately and ideally providing access to all-inclusive wraparound services for people who've experienced workplace sexual harassment. And so we've also have suggested that increased implementation and monitoring is required over the next, while these recommendations are being implemented, to make sure they're having an impact so that we can assess whether some of these strategies are working. Our terms of reference include a 3-year review, which I think will be interesting. So we're currently waiting on the Australian government to provide their formal response to our recommendations, which is now being slated for late in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I'm going to follow up in a little while when we have our discussions, both about prevention, because I would note that Natasha is going to be chairing the plenary panel on prevention, which is the opening plenary of the conference on June 8th. And I also want to follow up with you on the positive duty and take you back to a discussion I had on that in 1985 with Neil Rees, who went on to be the head of the Human Rights Commission in Victoria. Is that right, in Australia?
I can't quite remember if it was Victoria, but yes, I know we've spoken about him before.
Yes, good. Okay, thank you. Well, that was so enlightening. Thank you all. We're going to move now into a discussion among the panelists. One of the things that strikes me is that there's this mixture that I'm hearing from you and from other panelists we haven't heard from yet on other panels, but whose work I've been reading, I've been talking with, between optimism about the power of this social movement, which is affecting laws and affecting norms, and pessimism drawn from the strength of the blowback, the resistance to the resistance, from defamation cases to online shaming to, well, as I think it was Purna who talked about the woman in Bangladesh who was murdered as a result of making a Me Too disclosure. You know, the ultimate act of vengeance against whistleblowers. And I just wonder if anyone on the panel would like to say a few words about this dynamic conflict between the optimistic view of what this means and the skeptical or pessimistic view about what this means. Anyone? Yeah, Purna.
Thank you, David. I think they're really important points. My worry now is not only those individual risks that follow, but the possibility that it could have been seen as a moment in time. That worries me, that that moment may have been seen as past. Now, while everybody's attention is on COVID, it is rightly highlighting issues of domestic abuse, and child abuse actually also needs to be named much more in these situations. But I'm very curious to see and concerned to see how little sexual harassment is now featuring in those ongoing discussions. So I think the power of the movement and the organization that's been going on for decades has to be maintained and has to be regalvanized as we move forward into the next phase, where we must ensure that this work that I think, I talked about the change in public discourse, the push for changes at work and so on, that doesn't get lost in this moment and in this new era of COVID and post-COVID. That is something that worries me greatly. And I think we have to think about how to ensure that that momentum and that profound dynamic for change is maintained.
Thank you. And Robin, did you want to add something on this?
Yes, thank you, David. I think for me, my optimism stems from the fact that for the first time in my lifetime, we actually are starting to see policies and laws such as the ILO Convention C-190 that are driven by the voices of the workers who experience these things disproportionately, and thus those tools actually might work. What a shocking concept. Historically, we've had laws written by, frankly, men, and in the United States, white men, who have never experienced these things. And surprise, surprise, there's a disconnect, right, between everything from how the incident or the abuse is defined, its impact, and its remedies. And I think what gives me hope in this moment is a recognition that through Me Too, we see a shared understanding now of what's happening and an opportunity for solidarity that previously didn't exist because we weren't permitted or promoted or encouraged to talk about this.
Thank you, Robin. One of the comments that struck me in Rachel's presentation was her description of the Me Too movement and the power of social media as enabling us to hear voices that we otherwise wouldn't have heard, and that this is a sea change. And I'm wondering, I heard some of that in Purna's comments and in Robin's, and I'm wondering if each of them would like to just say a few more words on that topic. Can we start with Robin on that?
Sure, thank you. I do think that the movement that has evolved and then got wind from Me Too to address gender-based violence and harassment is different because it is being driven by groups of women who have previously never actually been asked or communicated with. It's just someone else has decided that this is happening and they've designed systems and structures that maybe would help. And sometimes I think intentionally would not help, to be totally honest, because it's about power. And there has been this lack of understanding, I think, historically about understanding the root causes of gender-based violence and harassment and sexual harassment, and the lack of focus on that. When we create safe spaces where women of all kinds of backgrounds and experiences feel free to talk about what they're doing, that solidarity enables them to use the abilities they already have. And they identify that one of the primary barriers historically has been the patriarchal structure that keeps men in positions of authority and keeps them oppressed. And by having more diverse voices, what's so fabulous is that the solutions look different. And the penalties, if you can use that term, look different. There's a lot more restorative justice language. One of the key features of solutions that have been coming forward and utilized by employers as a result of this is actually not about training on what the law says. But in fact, women are asking that if they come forward with a complaint, one of the solutions available to the person who did this to them is actually education and awareness about gender and gender inequality. So I'm really excited.
Rachel, did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. No, I think it is very important to note, as I believe Purna did earlier, that this movement is not without cost. And we have seen that women's human rights defenders, throughout time, and certainly in this moment, face grave repercussions for the important work that they're leading. In Sweden, for example, the woman who started the Me Too movement there, named Cissi Wallin, who came out and publicly named a man who she alleged sexually assaulted her, ended up being fined by a court and forced to pay someone who she alleges abused her. In China, some of the activists at the forefront of the movement there, a woman named Yu Xin, and who comes to mind in particular, who was an organizer at the university level and then traveled to the southern region of China to organize factory workers to address sexual harassment in the workplace there, is missing and has not been heard from since. There are many other of her colleagues who have been forced to flee and are currently in the United States or elsewhere. And in Brazil, where we've seen a connection between the rise of women's activism and growth in women's political participation, Marielle Franco, who was a courageous leader elected to the city council in Rio, was assassinated for raising her voice. So we know the costs are grave. I think the reason to feel optimistic is that women have awakened to the power of their voices. That's the reason that our book is called The Awakening. In country after country, we have heard women talk about the power of sharing their stories and raising their voices. And as long as we're able to sustain women coming forward and speaking up, my belief is that this activism will translate into changes not only in the realm of sexual harassment law, but also with respect to female participation in the labor force writ large, with respect to women's political participation and women's ability to participate in a range of other areas.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Purna, did you want to comment on that?
Thank you, David. Yes, I think this is a really crucial point of why the Me Too movement has profoundly changed our conversations and the way in which we have these conversations. I think what social media and the democratization of our channels of communication and organizing has meant is that we've been able to understand knowledge as arising from experience, not only from political expertise or policy geekiness or research experience, but the experience of being a victim or survivor of sexual harassment or sexual violence has become the foundation for our understanding and for our knowledge of what this constitutes. We'll look at what's happened, for example, in our international understandings of rape. The Akiyesu definition from the Rwanda Tribunal was very much about listening to what victims and targets of rape were saying about what sexual violence was for them. So I think it helps us to move from this dynamic of having lists of behaviors, for example, that are prohibited, to understanding relationships of inequality which shape situations of sexual harassment, violence, or other forms of violence. But I do think also we haven't finished that journey. I think there are some voices that have been marginal even to the movement around sexual harassment. And I think there are a range of areas of overlapping of different forms of inequality that we still need to do more about. And that's where I think ensuring that not just there are voices, but that voices are influential in shaping decision-making, that is a process that continues.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to your comments on the panel on intersectionality, where among other things, we will take up that question of the intersection between disability discrimination and sexual harassment. Rachel, did you want to add something here?
Thank you. Yes, have a question, Purna, for you, and so appreciate your presentation, and wonder if you could speak to what the United Nations is doing specifically to capitalize on the momentum of the Me Too movement and to ensure that these issues move forward.
Thanks, Rachel, and that's a really important point. And I think it fed momentum to look at what the UN does internally in terms of well, the 3 E's as I talk about: eliminating it, eradicating, and ending sexual harassment. We've got new policies, new guidelines, there's work going on improving investigations. So all of that is happening internally, but also I think the UN is looking to connect with that movement more globally in terms of changing the ways in which policies, laws, and practices are formulated. I would say this is very much a work in progress. And I think something that we know from the women's movement is that women speak all the time about these things, but they don't report. And that's a very interesting gap between the informal work that's going on and the formalization of that work and how we address that gap. So I think the work around ensuring that systems are better than they are in terms of addressing the work is ongoing and needs more attention. But I also think, like we've said in our discussions, that the momentum has become unavoidable.
Thank you. Katharina, you had a question.
So, my dear sister in Africa, Furaha-Joy, we have been already collaborating before COVID-19. Now we are a little bit stuck with our preparations for your first regional conference on how to end sexual harassment in Africa. My question to you would be, how can we support you? What do you need from us? And what would you need from all your sisters over the world? What can we do to support each other?
Thank you for that, Katharina. Thank you. Yes, you know, we probably just need to interrogate joint collaborations a little bit further, but I think that a good starting point would be sharing platforms like the way we did with the with the joint webinar that we had. That it should just not end there. We should have like a series where we identify common issues and continue to share, to share platforms to develop innovative strategies on how we can, dialogue on the issues that matter to both of us. And yeah, so I look forward to that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Furaha, you talked about this regional cooperation in Africa and the possibility or the dream of developing a regional model law. And I wanted to ask you how you do that, because in Europe we are fortunate to have the institutions and the structures in place to organize such kind of discussions and debates. So how do you do it in Africa? How will you move forward on the development of this model law?
Yeah, so we also have institutions and structures in Africa that can help us to facilitate this process. The difference is that it's not coming from the top. It's a bottom-up approach where we have identified the problem, we have identified the gaps, and we are proactive. And we are a network of organizations from across the continent. We are partners with the Association for Egyptian Female Lawyers, Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association. We've been very strategic about our partners outside the lawyers movement. We have partnered with media organizations, for instance. And then we've also formulated partnerships with policymakers, female politicians and policymakers. We've been strategic about who we are bringing on board. So we literally have a network of female policymakers and politicians who are supporting this movement, So what we have done is to go through a research process. And what we have done is to begin to pull together information, you know, in a more constructive way. And we have already pulled together existing laws on sexual harassment and then developing best practice benchmarks, and which we then use as like a tool, you know, a framework to say that this is what we propose a regional model could look like.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Furaha-Joy, you had a question you wanted to put to Katharina and to Karen.
Yes, we have been hearing a lot of stories about online harassment, online sexual harassment, because obviously more people are using, you know, the internet. But we don't have data to back that up. I was wondering that in your case, you've mentioned that violence seems to have moved from the physical to the online world. And have you gathered data on that? Are you relying on any data, or, you know, what do you use to come to that conclusion?
Well, I would not have hard data on that. I think this is really anecdotal information that we get from helplines, and that we get from, you know, helplines in the member states which warn us. Yeah, so I think I have no, you know, no survey. The time has been too short to gather that. But we have sent out questionnaires to member states which have replied, and so that's where we gather the data from.
Okay, let's hear now from Katharina.
My question, I would start with the Article 119 of the Rome Treaty, which was dedicated or established the equal pay. So that was in 1957. Now we are in 2020. We still don't have equal pay within our European member states. So my question to you is, do you think that strategic litigation, like for example the Dufresne case, would be helpful in order to strategically implement and enforce the already existing legislation on European level?
Yes, thank you. I think that we have, perhaps at least at EU level, that we have focused too much on individual enforcement by victims of discrimination, aiming at compensation for past discrimination. And I think that we should more focus in the future, or we should try to focus much more on litigation aiming at driving structural systemic change. And also why I'm here in Berkeley is one of the reasons is I'm looking at the ways that anti-discrimination laws are enforced here in the United States, to see whether we can be inspired by that. So I definitely agree, and I think we should brainstorm all together in Europe on how we can move in this direction towards more strategic litigation to drive structural change.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Karen. So you can count on us, on the European Women Lawyers Association, for this strategic goal, in which I think we want to reach all together. Thank you.
Karen, you had a question you wanted to put to Katharina and/or Furaha-Joy?
Yes, I had a question for each of you. My question to Katharina is, following her historical approach on equal pay, I wanted to ask you, in 2010, I worked together at the time with the Spanish presidency, and already at that time, the Spanish presidency had very high on its political agenda the issue of violence against women. It was perhaps the first presidency to put it so high on the agenda, and it led to the adoption, for instance, in Europe, on the European protection orders in the criminal and the civil field. And I wanted to ask, so that's 10 years years ago, whether you see an evolution, whether you see a development since then, because I think you're definitely in a country that has put it on so high on the agenda for so long.
So yes, I would say absolutely. So I think 2010 with Zapatero as president was really a high moment. I think we lost a little bit of track when there was a change to the Conservative Party, to the People Party, PP. For them, I would also think, and I know that they would like to have a country without violence against women, but it's not on such a high level for them. Whereas now we again have a socialist as president, and again, it's very, very important for them to eliminate and eradicate violence against women and girls. So I think, yes, in the last 10 years, there was a very good movement, and I think we are there again and want to lead again within the European Union.
And Furaha-Joy, you had a question you wanted to put to Katharina and to Karen.
Yes. So to Katharina, I would like to ask, you know, the statistics that she shared on violence against women in Spain, and on how this occurs on a daily level is, you know, is quite staggering. And I would like to know, what is the role of the police in this regard? Are they trained to deal with issues of gender-based violence? Do they have safe spaces within, you know, police departments that women can come and report on these issues when they are called out to, you know, to address domestic violence and arrive on the scene? Are they trained in, you know, to handle those cases on the scene? Do they have like a gender person who accompanies them? How are the police trained?
Yeah, so thank you very much for this question. The development that women on a daily basis are sexual violanced or that they report about it. I also think it's not a good sign to have such a high number, but that doesn't mean that hasn't existed before. That just means now that women reported more. And now I come to your question. Absolutely. This also led to the fact that the Spanish police, and we have different police, though. We have the military police, which is the Guardia Civil. We have the national police, which would be the Policía. And then on the municipalities, we have also police. So I know that the Guardia Civil, which would be the military police, and also the national police, that they in fact receive trainings, education in gender. So they are formed, they are trained when there are acts of sexual violence against women. So they have their own protocol, and they know what to do then in this case. So they know exactly how to treat these cases. I think not all of the police uses these protocols. So I think until now, nothing really happens if you don't use the protocol. But from what I know is, I lack data right now, but from the cases I know, that the Spanish police normally applies the policies. And so they're very sensitive with gender-based violence. And so they receive special education. I don't actually know if they always are accompanied by a gender expert. That I would have to find out. It's a very interesting question. Thank you for that. But I know that there are also experts within the police that give speeches and talks to their colleagues, but also in schools and to the civil society on sexual aggressions or sexual violence in order to prevent it.
I'd like to follow up on Puja's comments about backlash Now, we're going to have a separate panel on backlash, and I think appropriately, it's going to be led by another Australian, Karen O'Connell, who has written about backlash and defamation. But it seems like such an important topic that runs through all of the resistance to sexual harassment is the fear of backlash, whether it's through defamation, whether it's through shaming, whether it's through losing control of the situation, like the young woman you were talking about, Puja. I can't remember her name. The athlete,
Vera-Joy.
Vera-Joy. Thank you. Where here she is in the midst of a prosecution that she didn't ask for, and then not being believed by the magistrate. And I just would, Natasha, do you want to say something more about the problem of backlash in Australia? And then Puja, maybe you could respond to that.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think that our experience is very similar, particularly to that you outlined, Puja, for Vera-Joy. And in fact, we had a couple of very high-profile defamation cases in Australia and around sexual harassment, where we either had someone called as a witness who didn't particularly want to be, but then was found not to be credible by the judge. So I think there's absolute recognition with respect to how the legal system operates, and that there is very little incentive for women to take a matter, certainly through our legal system. And even though we do have a complaint handling procedure, which the Australian Human Rights Commission administers for sexual harassment complaints, we experience the same problems that your Equal Opportunity Commission experiences in Hong Kong there with respect to some of those constraints. Though we do have, where we have conciliated complaints, some very positive feedback. But the backlash issue in Australia, I think, David, is really alive. It's something that's used as a tool to silence women, to discredit women, and it's been really effective, actually. We feel that the Me Too movement in Australia has effectively been silenced because of all the things that we're talking about with respect to how women are then turned on, victims are then turned on.
And similar results, Puja, in Hong Kong?
Yes. So, it's, first of all, Vera-Joy's case was very difficult for the community to accept, because when she first came out, people were extremely sympathetic, supportive. The chief executive and the secretary for security, all of them talked about how children, so she was 13 when she experienced this abuse the first time, how children needed to be protected against sexual abusers. And especially given that the majority of children, I think about 82% of them, know the perpetrators of the abuse. So there was a strong call out to protect children. But then to see how her court case progressed was hugely disappointing. And it led to many activists calling out against sort of the pressure that is put on victims to step up and prove their claims or go through sort of the traditional channel. And then, there were a lot of comments there saying real sexual harassment victims should, complain to the police. And I think the worst sort of, the hardest hit that we've been in Hong Kong has actually just been in the past couple of days. There were complaints coming out about sexual harassment experienced by female protesters when they're being held in the police station, so detained before charges being pressed or having their statements taken. And we understand that there have been long detention periods because there were so many protesters held at any given time. And so one protester came forward and alleged that she was gang raped inside a police station. It was very difficult for her to come forward. She sought an order for anonymity, which has been preserved, but the police have in the meantime started to selectively release certain details of her complaint, and have even gone as far as saying that her statement does not match the CCTV footage that we have. So we're very doubtful whether this case is going to be established per her complaint. And this week, the police announced that they're going after her for making a false statement to the police, and that she is now a wanted person because they can't locate her. So apparently she's absconded from Hong Kong. And that, I think, really sort of builds on what happened with the trial against the predator in Loy's case, but with the protests and the extreme distrust towards the police. And then this recent revelation of what the police is doing, it's turning the victim into a defendant for a complaint that she's made against the police. They're going after her, which is again in line with similar trends that we've seen with the police admonishing public broadcasters and even an academic who they claimed were trying to sour the public's mind or smear the police. So it seems unlikely that sexual harassment victims or domestic abuse victims would be able to trust the system given the current climate. And obviously a lot has been said about how COVID is impacting victims of sexual harassment and domestic violence in particular. And I think Hong Kong's political conditions right now, against sort of the backdrop of our weak sexual harassment mechanisms, all of this coalesces to really put victims in a very, very vulnerable position.
Okay, thank you. Do any of you have questions for other panelists that you'd like to ask? Puja.
Thank you, David. Natasha, I wanted to follow up on sort of the recommendations that were made. And I noticed, as you said, there's a positive duty that you're encouraging. So how have employers responded to this particular recommendation? Because clearly the mechanisms currently are failing, but that really seems as far as they're willing to go. So what kind of support have they sought from the Commission?
Thanks, Puja. That is an excellent question. And in convening the inquiry, we did have a reference group that had a number of union representatives, as well as employer representatives, policymakers, etc., academics on it. And part of that strategy, of course, was to bring employers along. I think what we've seen in Australia is there is absolutely an appetite with employers to prevent sexual harassment. They all recognise that it's a problem, that it costs them money, and therefore there's at least an economic incentive, if no other reason, to prevent it in their workplace. So they want solutions. Did they want the positive duty as a solution? Largely, I'm going to say no. That's not true of all employer representative groups. We did have some positive feedback from some employer representative groups who just said, look, everything we've done to date hasn't worked. It hasn't shifted the dial. It seems like we need something to change. And if a positive duty is one of those recommendations, we're willing to look at it. And so essentially, there's a number of ways in which a positive duty obviously can operate. And I think one of the things that we have suggested that we implement in Australia, and this will be in the event that there is an appetite with government to legislate for a positive duty, that we would look at having a guideline that the Commission produces. Because in effect, what we already have in Australia with respect to sexual harassment is vicarious liability. So it's not too much of a jump. And what we're saying is actually vicarious liability has worked in a sense, like it has made employees think about what their role and responsibility is. We're going to take that and just expand it ever so slightly and say what you need to be doing are reasonable, proportionate measures. That would include things like at your Monday weekly meeting reminding people of what sexual harassment looks like, because we found very low understanding of actually what constitutes sexual harassment, and then saying, and here's the places you can go to if it happens. Whether you're a small business, whether you're a large business, it's more of an extension of what they already currently do under our vicarious liability laws.
If I may add to that question, Natasha, has there been discussion of whether a violation of the positive duty in and of itself is a violation of the statute and can lead to liability and an award of damages? That's been the great debate here in California since the 1980s. And it's an issue that I worked on back in the 80s. I had a hand in drafting the statute that created the positive duty in California law. But then there was the fight over what it really meant in terms of liability and damages.
Yeah, David, we haven't gone down that path yet, and that if in the event that there is appetite in government, that is the next step that will come. We do have one state in Australia, Victoria, that currently has a positive duty, and it doesn't go so far as to say that damages can be awarded. So I think what the most that we could realistically expect, particularly with the current government, is that who are sort of who like less regulation than more, is that it would be a similar positive duty as that exists without those protections, added protections.
Thank you. Purna, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
David, I did, and it touches on what I just mentioned briefly, if I may, and it's about, you know, Rachel's really important point about social media having become a space of democratization of movements and participation. And I think the challenge, which is how do we ensure that that becomes a space that we can make less dangerous than it has been, less bullying, less prone to chasing those who speak up out of that space. I think that requires a bit more work. And Rachel, I don't know if you had some thoughts about how we might do that.
No, I think the answer to that it really relates to the answer to how we address this issue more broadly, which is changes in laws and changes in cultural understanding. When it comes to laws, you know, I think it's important to note that in many authoritarian governments around the world, that, you know, censorship is being used to prevent women from raising their voices, from sharing their stories, from organizing, from making change in this area. I mentioned China in particular as an example, but this is also happening in Egypt, in the Philippines, in many other countries. And so I think ensuring that there is space to speak and to organize is critical to ensuring that there's continued progress. And I think we are seeing that reflected with respect to not only the crackdown in China, but also the changes that the government has already proposed there, really in response to the public pressure. And of course, the online harassment and abuse issue is a problem in every country in the world where these issues are being discussed. I think that our cultural understanding also has shifted and hopefully will continue to shift, because there's such a strong interplay between the cultural change and discussion we're seeing and the legal changes that are being contemplated and in some places being put into effect. And so, you know, I think as that cultural dialogue continues to shift, we need to make sure that this issue of speech and activism online is part of that conversation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So that completes our first panel, our first of 7 pre-recorded panels for this conference on global resistance to sexual harassment and violence. And thank you to our 8 panelists for their participation. And thank you also to our 2 Berkeley student producers, Laura Valencia and Kelly Crabtree. And thank you all for joining and listening. And I hope you will join us for the next 6 pre-recorded panels as well, and then for our live sessions on June 8th and 9th.